So, as Rick said, I've had a long career on both sides of the fence. I had 30 years in Big Pharma. Now the last 10 years, co-founded Helix with a PhD student at Cambridge University. I'll tell you a little bit about that to start with, but the slides are lessons from both sides of the fence, what it takes to succeed. We've heard actually bits of this from lots of presentations, but I hope I've pulled it all together on just 5 slides here, actually. Helix is a rare disease company founded 10 years ago with a PhD student from Cambridge University. Nick Ciro was incredibly influential in this. My co-founder Tim and I had lunch with Nick Maison de Steck, I think it's called, isn't it? That wonderful pub down the road, because we're based very close to Beacon. Yeah, and it was one of those sort of life-changing conversations. We decided to use our AI systems to work in rare diseases, and here we are now. We've got, we're starting a phase 2 clinical trial in a rare cancer, neurofibromatosis 1, NF1, this year, a drug I invented using our systems in 2018. And we've got a combination of 2 drugs for treating autism, Fragile X, which gives complete coverage of all the symptomology in the preclinical models. So I'm hoping we're going to get that one into the clinic very soon. We're talking to the regulators at the moment. Earlier career, worked for 4 of the top 10 big pharma. As Rick said, I led the Viagra project actually from startup through to clinical phase 2. I designed the drug myself actually. I was named inventor of the patent and fought Pfizer for years to keep it alive. It was pretty tough until we got the breakthrough effects in a phase 2A. And also Revatio for rare disease, primary hypertension, and etatriptan for migraine. So I've got 3 drugs to market so far. Okay, let's move on. So it's pretty obvious that if you're going to interest pharma or biotech, they've got to survive financially. There's got to be a commercial return. And that's the tough bit. It really is. And the remainder of my slides, just 5 slides, are going to go into all the factors that have to be in place for them to get a decent commercial return. There are lots of factors. But it's not all negative, because actually there are so many advantages in working rare diseases. I think probably a quarter of rare diseases are monogenic, single gene defect. And it's so easy to model those in a mouse. You just take the human gene and put it into a mouse. Personally, I only choose myself to work on those because the translation of a molecule's efficacy in those preclinical models into the clinic should be much, much better than it is for most diseases. So it de-risks enormously. And then when you've got all the savings from working with a repurposed molecule, and we've heard some of those and I'll summarize them, there are actually major benefits to working in rare diseases. So the first thing is patents or patents, depending on which country you come from. There are several ways to thinking about this. This is the primary way in which a biotech or pharma wants to protect its drug. It means they have 20 years from the date of filing, but usually only 8 to 10 years from when the drug gets to market, when they have exclusive rights to sell that drug. Nobody else can. Repurposed drug, though, it's a whole lot harder. If that drug is already generic and cheap, it's pretty much impossible for a pharmaceutical company to make money from it because it can just be used off-label, as it's called by a physician. But there are ways around this, as I'll show here. You can get a second medical use patent for a repurposed drug. Stronger in some countries than others. It varies a little bit. But they are quite valuable. There are quite strict conditions. If you show, for instance, that ibuprofen or aspirin works in something, it might be pretty obvious because people have been using it. So it has to be absolutely non-obvious, and nobody's ever published anything like this before or even suggested it in public before. So strict criteria there. It is much easier, though, to get a patent if you modify that chemical structure slightly into a new chemical entity, NCE, but then you've got a much longer development pathway, of course, and much higher cost. So there's a real trade-off here in deciding what to do. But there's an easy way to do this, a combination of two drugs. Well, easy in the sense of getting a patent, not so easy in the sense of doing the clinical trials, because doing clinical trials with combinations is a lot more complicated. So there's a trade-off there. I've called this a new medical entity rather than a new chemical entity. It's a combination of two drugs, like our Fragile X drug combination, which gives very good coverage of the symptomology of the diseases. Nobody had ever suggested putting these two drugs together, so we've got a very strong patent position for it. I really would recommend this way forward, if you possibly can, for rare diseases. Then the other we've heard about is what I've called repositioning here. I know people are using this in different ways in this conference. But most drugs fail in clinical trials. If they are safe and have been into dozens or even hundreds of patients, they actually are very valuable. There's been maybe 10 years work on it, a lot of preclinical testing, a lot of safety evaluation to get through the regulatory hurdles, and then it's been in humans for several years. And it's safe, but it just didn't work. That is a highly valuable molecule that does have an NCE patent. So commercially, it's defensible. It could be repositioned into a rare disease. So I would recommend looking at phase 2B, phase 3 failed assets, where there's very clear evidence of good safety, looking at those for repurposing. It's probably the easiest way of doing this, frankly. And then, as you know, in addition to patents, you can get orphan drug designation, equivalent kind of systems in the US and Europe. It does give you some protection. I think you'd find it difficult to get a pharmaceutical industry to develop the drug only on the basis of the ODD, but if you've got a patent as well, that strengthens the case. So now on to sales and profit, which is really what the big companies are interested in. And rare diseases, by definition, have low prevalence. But of course, there's a cutoff for rare diseases. And we've seen the figures earlier. Some of these rare diseases are 1.5 to 2 million patients. That's a lot, and actually it borders on a common disease. You can interest the pharmaceutical industry in that sort of larger cohort of rare diseases. So again, commercially viable, provided you meet those other criteria I just mentioned. Higher pricing can help the companies make money from diseases with fewer patients, lower prevalence, but there is a backlash against higher pricing. There have been some egregious examples of this. Typically a drug might cost 10 or 20,000 for a common disease. Typically, it might cost 80 to 100,000 for a rare disease, but we've seen pricing at $500,000, and gene therapy is running at 3 to 5 million. Now, the payers really can't afford this, especially if we have many more drugs. We're going to be in trouble there. So there is actually a big backlash against this. If you do development in children, there is an FDA pediatric voucher you can get. These are worth quite a lot of money, about 100 million they can be sold on for. So it's a way actually of financing research in rare diseases if you wish to go that way. Drug development risks are actually a lot lower for repurposed drugs. We know the dose for humans. We know the drug safety profile. And we know the DMPK, drug metabolism and pharmacokinetics. This is huge de-risking because a lot of drugs fail for these reasons. So if you're talking to the pharmaceutical companies, use slides like this to explain the advantages to them as well as the disadvantages, is what they'll come with. So they get a balanced picture there. Then clinical trials, the cost can be a lot lower. Now, again, with the pharmaceutical company, it's a kind of reward to risk ratio they're looking at. If the clinical trial costs are lower and a much higher chance of success because the molecule is de-risked, that begins to shift the balance in favor of doing it. Potentially faster to market. It may be possible to have much smaller clinical trials. For instance, AstraZeneca got a cancer drug approved in the US for a rare cancer. Only 50 patients treated. Yeah, you don't have to do thousands. Viagra, we had to do 5,000, new molecule, and it was nearly all around proving safety. I mean, you couldn't miss the efficacy. You know, a few hundred was enough, but 10 times more needed just to prove the safety. But there's a much lower barrier in rare diseases. You can de-risk first with individual clinical case studies. I've got, I'll come to that in a moment, talk about that a little bit more. The limitations, though, and this is the regulatory pathway, is a really tough one. We've heard this time and again today. If this is the first drug to ever go forward for a disease, you've got a long path ahead, because discussing with the regulatory authorities exactly what endpoints they want, what they will approve, is tough. There's no precedent for it, so actually they don't know, and they make mistakes, as we heard earlier. So you really need to work with world experts on the regulatory pathway and get engaged in that discussion right from the beginning to just find out how tough it's going to be. Patient recruitment can be a barrier. There may be no history of clinical trials. There may be no clinics with experience in doing it, if it's going to be the first to market, or if there are clinics that have tested drugs, because there are a few patients, they may all be ready tied up trying other people's drugs in those. So, that can be a big barrier too. And my final slide, FDA, EMA, IND. So IND means investigational new drug. If you've got a new drug, you want to put it in patients for the first time, or an old drug in patients for a different disease for the first time, you've got to submit an IND article. Well, it's like a busload of paper if it was printed. It's massive. However, our cancer drug, we went to the FDA. We had the pre-IND meeting recently. They tried to cancel it, actually. They said it's a repurposed drug. We don't need the meeting. Just get on with it, basically. We actually had a 15-minute meeting in the end. So there are big advantages for repurposed drug when it comes to getting approval for the FDA to go in patients. Another way here is what are called investigator-led trials. So clinicians that run these clinics may be able to test your repurposed drug without going through the FDA, or they can go to the FDA and say, well, trust us more or less. It's not a big bureaucratic process. It's fast, it's cheap, there's a low regulatory burden. You can do that. We're doing that with one of our drugs at the moment. You get some initial signal, gives you the confidence then to spend a lot of money going through the formal process. But be aware that the results almost certainly won't meet regulatory standards. You've then got to spend the money on scaling that up. You may be able to get a drug registration with just phase 1 and phase 2 trials. You don't have to do the big phase 3s because there's a huge unmet need out there. So again, much quicker, cheaper. But to do this, the drug mustn't have been registered in Europe, etc. Otherwise, you've got the off-label use. So if you're going to talk to biotech and pharma, get them to see both sides of the story. They'll just come, well, there aren't many patients, it's going to cost a lot of money. But actually, they can save a lot of time and money with a much higher chance of success in rare diseases quite often as well.